There he is. Damon.
Okay, perfect.
You see him there?
Yeah,
there?
teach us, Kev. Let's keep it brief. Let's keep it like your heart, short.
Yes. Okay. Tell me, you stop me here because this is okay. So interruptions during. Okay. First of all, this is for refer for. Who is that name? I've got two people here. The first one is Israel ben Chaya Michal, Yosef Israel ben Chaya Michal, who had surgery yesterday. He was one of the survivors of the Meron tragedy. And then my niece, who got COVID today in Australia, my niece Rachel Bat Leah, my brother's youngest daughter. So refer Shleima to them and to all Cholim and to Arthur as well. Okay. So
Amen.
Laws concerning interruptions during Pesukei de Zimra. Okay. Because Pesukei de Zimra is surrounded by brachot, Baruch Shamar up to Yishtabach, after them, they are considered one segment, and interruptions in the middle of the recital is forbidden. So it's considered like one prayer. However, in cases of great need, such as to prevent a loss, it is permissible to interrupt by speaking, and according to Mishnah Berurah, where before and after the interruption, one should say the verses Baruch Hashem that appear before Vayavarech David. Similarly, in order to prevent insulting someone, one is permitted to greet him or her. Okay, there are those who say that when one must relieve himself in the middle of Pesukei de Zimra, he should delay the recital of Asher Yatzar until after Yishtabach, so as not to interrupt Pesukei de Zimra. However, it is best to recite Asher Yatzar immediately after relieving oneself, for if he delays it, he may forget to say it altogether. If a person hears brachot or kaddish in the middle of Pesukei de Zimra, he may not answer Baruch Hu, Baruch Shemo, but he may say Amen. Since he is engaged in the mitzvah of reciting Pesukei de Zimra, he is exempt from the mitzvah responding to other matters of sanctity, whatever that means anyway. If a person's concentration during Pesukei de Zimra will be disturbed if he interrupts to answer Amen, it is best to refrain from doing so, and it's not a problem. He can answer Amen, and if he doesn't answer Amen, it's also okay. I saw that earlier. If he hears the congregation has reached Kedusha, he must stand with his legs together and join, so that he will not stand out as one who doesn't participate in matters of sanctity with the congregation. So they're like, as they say, let's finish with this. It says that one shouldn't distance oneself from the congregation, and that applies to davening. That applies to being concerned for other Jews all over the world in Israel. If you're apathetic and you don't give two hoots about it, a continental hoot, then that's not a good thing. You need to, so it applies in all areas. So anyway, that's the story.
Okay.
And with tefillin, you can't, once you start putting on tefillin, you're not allowed to, you actually can't answer, you can't respond to anything if you're putting on tefillin.
Fair enough.
Because it's also, you can't create a hefsek. Okay.
All right, guys, let's get started. Well done, Kev. Yeah. Thank you, mate. Thank you. I appreciate it. Really. All right, I'm going to share my screen, and then Gavin can read. I'm not sure if Arthur's paywall or where Arthur is.
Maybe he fell asleep.
Cooking the books.
Yeah.
In the kitchen.
Cooking the books. Okay. Gav, you want to read that Mishnah in the middle?
Yeah, sure. The Mishnah continues to teach the laws of a fire that spreads from one person's domain to that of another. If one lights a fire within his own property, up to what distance can the fire pass? Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says, we view him as though he were in the middle of a base core. Rabbi Eliezer says, 16 amos, like a public highway. Rabbi Akiva says, 50 amos. Rabbi Shimon says, the Torah states, the one who ignites the fire shall pay, which teaches that it all depends on the fire.
Yeah, well read. Okay, so basically, guys, what we're looking here is the Mishnah is trying to define the furthest distance a fire would be likely to travel over empty ground. We're not talking about a thorn bush where that naturally is flammable and can get out of control, but over empty ground, what's your worst case scenario? So obviously the one who lights the fire would have to leave this distance between his property and that empty ground space and the property of the nearest neighbor. So that empty ground is the distance between the two properties. And if he does so and the fire still spreads to his neighbor's property, it's an unexpected mishap, it's an ones, for which he is not liable. But if he leaves less than the required distance, he obviously acted negligently and he must make financial restitution. So this Mishnah is linked to the previous one that you can see, which Gavin read yesterday, which basically explained as referring only to a rising fire. In other words, it's a fire that streams directly upward. So even then, you must still leave the requisite gap between such a fire and the neighborhood property, just in case it shifts horizontally. And we said that was about 16 amos, the space of a road. If there's water, it's 9 amos because you've got a fire retardant there. But in empty ground, it's 16 amos. But as for a bent fire, we described it as a fire propelled by wind, and it moves along the ground consuming flammable material. It could spread in an unlimited distance. So in the case of a bent fire, none of the distances proposed in the Mishnah would suffice. The owner would be liable for any damage it causes, regardless of how far it traveled. So guys, what we're saying here is that this is a middle-of-the-road solution. In other words, we're not talking about a fire that's carried by the wind, because then you're liable no matter what. That is an extreme, because it's just like a fire that was propelled by flammable material. The wind here is fueling the fire because of the oxygen levels. Therefore, there's no amount of distance that would exempt you from liability. We're saying here, if there's no wind to carry it and there's no flammable material because the field is bare, then what is the correct distance? We already learned with a rising fire, in other words, where it just goes horizontally, 16 amos suffices, but not in a case where it's a bent fire or a, what do you call it, a scorch earthing sort of fire with no wind as a factor. That's the key point here. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to deal with a particular issue. So Rabbi Shimon apparently holds that the owner of a fire is liable no matter how far the fire traveled, because it causes damage. So based on this understanding of Rabbi Shimon's statement, the Gemara is looking back and said, hang on, this contradicted another one of his rulings. And it says, and does Rabbi Shimon not hold that there is a distance of a fire? In other words, is he truly of the opinion that one's liability for causing fire damage has nothing to do with the distance between fire and the damaged party? Okay? Because what did we learn in the Mishnah? Let me just see if I've got the source for you guys. It's Bava Basra 20b. Okay. So, the Gemara initially understands Rabbi Shimon's statement to mean it all depends on the damage done by the fire. That's explained by Tosfot. In other words, the owner of the fire must pay the entire damage, regardless if there's a decent gap, etc., as long as it damaged the neighbor's property. But here it says in Bava Basra, he does have a concept in 20b of the fact that there is a limitation in terms of your liability. So in that Mishnah in Bava Basra, it says a person may not set up an oven in a house unless there's an empty space 4 amos high above it, lest it set fire to the ceiling. So if you set up an oven in an upper story, it may not be placed there unless there's a layer of plaster beneath it 3 tefachim thick. So in case it sets fire to the floor beams. Does that make sense, guys? In other words, the layer of plaster above the beams separates the lower and upper stories, must be 3 tefachim thick. And how it works is, it seems to obviously indicate there that it's a precautionary measure. But if it's with regard to a stove in an upper story of plaster, that layer would only have to be 1 tefach thick. Guys, do you see where we are dealing with here, or not really? I can just make it a bit clearer for you.
Damon, sorry, just repeat it. I got a call. I had to turn the phone over.
Yeah, I know.
I didn't. Sorry.
No problem.
Yeah.
All right, so listen, there's two things we're distinguishing with. We're distinguishing the difference between a stove and an oven. A stove is technically smaller than an oven. Who the heck is trying to call me now? I'm not interested in this. Okay, sorry, guys. So, all right, guys, look, you've got a stove that's smaller than an oven because it just deals with cooking from above. Like you get a 2-plate stove or whatever the case may be, even in those days. You had, I don't know if they had some sort of gas, natural gas, or they had some sort of coal, but an oven obviously is meant to cook a greater amount of food, so it's larger. And what you require there are thick protective barriers beneath it. Okay. So, in other words, according to Rashi, the residents of the town can insist that the owner of the oven observe those precautions, because the oven can set fire to the beams above or beneath it, and it could put all their lives in jeopardy, including their property, their homes. So then there are other commentators, apart from Rashi, that explain the entire Mishnah as referring to a 2-story house, in which each of the 2 stories is owned by a different person. So if the oven is in the lower story, the owner of the upper story can prevent it from being positioned within 4 amos of the beams between the 2 floors. And if the oven in that case is in the upper story, the owner of the lower story can insist that the floor beneath it be of the requisite thickness. Okay, which is 3 amos. You get that, guys? What's the point of this? It's basically saying, in this case, Rabbi Shimon says that there is a certain precautionary distance where you're not liable, but if you don't observe that, your fellow townhouse tenants can prevent you from setting up a stove or an oven there. So it seems to say that there are parameters at which you've taken precautions and you're off the hook. And because it says, and if despite the owner's observance of these precautions, he causes damage, in other words, his oven or stove causes a fire that damaged neighboring property, he pays for what he damaged. But that's the view of the rabbis. Rabbi Shimon says the sages did not state these measurements for distancing an oven or a stove, except to establish that if it caused damage, its owner is exempt from having to pay. So this is a proof where Rabbi Shimon is even more lenient than the rabbis. Does that make sense? Because since the sages determined that these precautions will prevent the house from being set ablaze, one who observes them has done all that he can be expected to do. So if there is damage that results despite his adherence to those codes, it's an unexpected mishap for which he is not liable. Makes sense? Just how's it, Ken? Good. So, guys, do you see what I'm saying? Have I lost you guys? Have I got you guys?
Just do that last minute. Just the last minute.
All right, no problem.
Sorry, because we got the instructions. No, I heard everything except that last minute.
I know. I didn't want to point anybody out. So, all right, so I'm just going to repeat this. If despite the owner's observance of these precautions that are required in the community, he causes damage. In other words, his oven or his stove causes a fire that damaged neighboring property. He pays for what he damaged. But Rabbi Shimon says the sages did not state these measurements for distancing an oven or a stove, except to establish that if it causes damage, its owner is exempt from having to pay. In other words, he's saying the whole reason it was established is by giving parameters at which he'd be off the hook. So Rabbi Shimon rules here that an owner of a fire who observes the required precautions is not liable for the damages fire is causing. So the rabbis are saying something more than that. They're also saying that these are the safety measures. It's not just about payment, because lives can be lost in a fire. And I'm sure Rabbi Shimon would agree. But he's saying that the reason these parameters are set is also because of financial liability. So how in the case of our Mishnah can he say that the owner is liable in all circumstances? So obviously the Gemara answers by reinterpreting Rabbi Shimon's statement in our Mishnah. Rav Nachman said in the name of Rabbi Bar Ahuva, Rabbi Shimon means that it all depends on the height of the fire. So let me just give you an idea. So a tall and a large fire would travel a greater distance than a small one. That's why it discerns between an oven and a stove, for example, about your precautionary measures. So the Gemara is basically answering that Rabbi Shimon does subscribe to the idea that one who leaves the prescribed distance between his fire and the neighboring property is not liable for the damage it does there, but the required distance is not the same in all circumstances. In other words, it's determined on a case-by-case basis, depending on the size of the fire. So, for example, if your fire is the size that might travel 20 amos, you're liable for any damage it causes within 20 amos of the original location, but you're not liable for what it consumes beyond that point. So, although the Gemara specifies the height of the fire, Rabbi Shimon holds that the matter is dependent on other circumstances as well, maybe such as the amount of fuel, the accessibility of combustible materials, etc., that sort of thing. So there are other factors, not just the height of the existing fire, which makes sense. Because even if you've got a small fire, the size of what do you call those things? My brother used to have with a flint. What was it called, Kev?
Let's firelighters.
No. The cigarette lighter. It's famous.
Big.
Zippo.
Zippo. Oh, for Zippo. That's it. So with that, I promise you, you throw that in a dry forest, that'll be the end of the forest. It doesn't matter how small the forest is. So that's what Rabbi Shimon is saying, that you've also got to take into account the amount of flammability there. So Rabbi Shimon's view is recorded only in the context of our Mishnah, which deals with a horizontal span of land that has to be left between one's fire and your neighboring property. So nevertheless, you do have a case where some Rishonim maintain that Rabbi Shimon disagrees with the previous Mishnah's ruling as well. In other words, which concerns a wall or a river. In their view, Rabbi Shimon holds that there's no standard measure for a wall or a river either. Rather, if a fire crosses that type of obstruction, the owner's liability is decided on a case-by-case basis in light of the prevailing circumstances. What do we mean? Is that there's certain types of fire retardants that are stronger than another. There's certain types of fire that water actually aggravates it more. I don't know if you know that. Arthur, you were telling me. Arthur? I can't hear you on mute.
I'm here most of the time.
Okay, well, if you're not in the space, I'm not going to aggravate you. I can see you on the space.
No, I didn't want to go make eggs, and I'm going to get off making eggs. So I was comfortable. I'm going to go make scrambled eggs because she's hungry. So I'm going to get up now and go make eggs.
Okay, man. All right. I wish you better. But like there was a movie called Backdraft, which showed that many fires were spread, especially in the kitchen, that have got fuel within it, causing a fire. If you throw water, it's going to spread. It's not going to be a retardant. That's what Rabbi Shimon means. So the Rishonim note that there's a contradiction. All the Tanaim of our Mishnah agree that one who took the standard precautions is not liable. Is not liable to pay should damage occur. So how do you reconcile this with the Mishnah in Bava Basra, where the sages imply liability even in those circumstances? Okay, so the Rishonim say that the sages' ruling in Bava Basra applies specifically to an oven because the fire constantly burns within it and it requires a much greater level of supervision. So you must watch it all the time so that if flames escape, you can contain them in time. Should you fail to do that degree of supervision, you've acted negligently and therefore you're liable for the resulting damage. Does that make sense, guys? Okay. So now what we're going to say is the Gemara now determines the law with respect to the dispute in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yosef said in the name of Rav Yehuda, who said in the name of Shmuel. the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon. And so Rav Nachman said in the name of Shmuel, the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon. And what does that actually mean? Is that the Gemara does not rule in accordance with Rabbi Eliezer, although his view is recorded anonymously in the previous Mishnah. The rule is that where an anonymous Mishnah is followed by a Mishnah, all right, sorry guys, threw me off. Let me just explain this. Let me get my thought together. The Gemara doesn't rule in accordance with Rabbi Eliezer, right? Although his view is recorded anonymously in the previous Mishnah. Because there's a rule that wherever there's an anonymous Mishnah and it's followed by a Mishnah that cites a dispute about the same matter, the halacha does not necessarily follow the anonymous ruling. It's not necessarily the case. So this particular Mishnah follows Rabbi Shimon. Okay, guys, I think let's stop there so we could join with Rav Simcha Steinhauer. Does that make sense?
Damon.
No, let's end. Yeah.
So someone wants to put a stove or a apartment building. They have to be careful about the height that's installed, otherwise it could cause the fire.
Not only the height, but also the flooring, because it could burn through.
Okay.
Yeah, both. It can't be made out of wood. It's got to be some sort of plastering that's non-flammable, like with brickwork in between. If you're in a townhouse complex, 100%. Gav, you and I have to join Rav Simcha Steinhauer.
Okay, sure. I must need to make a call. Thanks, guys. Cheers. What time tomorrow?
We'll discuss it. We'll discuss it on WhatsApp or whatever. But let's go now.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cheers, guys.
All right. Cheers, guys.